The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a woman in hospital scrubs who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. I was in the common room at Riverside Home, folding donated clothes that smelled like other people's fabric softener, when Mrs. Chun called me to the front desk. The woman handed me the envelope without meeting my eyes, mumbled something about urgent matters, and left before I could ask questions. Inside was a single sentence typed on hospital letterhead. Robert Grant has requested your presence. He says your family. I read it 3 times. The words didn't change. Robert Grant. I'd never heard that name before in my life, and I'd spent 17 years memorizing every scrap of information about my past, which wasn't much. Parents dead in a car accident when I was 6 months old. No other relatives identified. That was the story, the whole story, the only story I'd ever been told. Now someone named Robert Grant was claiming I was family, and he was dying in a hospital 20 miles away. Mrs. Chun drove me because I couldn't afford a cab and the buses didn't run that route on Tuesdays. She asked if I knew who this man was. I said no. She asked if I was scared. I said I didn't know what I was. The truth was something cold had settled in my chest, something that felt like hope and dread mixed together in equal measure. I'd stopped hoping for family years ago. Hope was dangerous when you lived in a place designed for people nobody wanted. The hospital smelled like disinfectant and sadness. We found his room on the 3rd floor, past walls painted that specific shade of pale green that's supposed to be calming but just makes you think about illness. Room 317. The door was half open. Mrs. Chun touched my shoulder and said she'd wait in the hall, that this felt like something I needed to do alone. I appreciated that about her. She knew when to step back. He was smaller than I expected, which is a strange first thought about a dying stranger who claims to know you. Robert Grant lay in the hospital bed with tubes running into his arms and a breathing apparatus strapped to his face. His skin had that papery quality that comes right before the end, gray and thin like old newspaper. But his eyes were alert when they found mine, and something in them made my breath catch. I'd seen those eyes before. Every morning. In the mirror. I stood in the doorway, frozen. A nurse brushed past me, checked something on a monitor, and left without speaking. The room felt too small and too large at the same time. He lifted one hand, trembling, and gestured for me to come closer. I did. I don't know why. Maybe because he looked at me like I mattered, like my presence in that room was the most important thing in the world. His hand found mine. The grip was weak but deliberate. He pulled the breathing mask down with his other hand, struggling with the effort. His voice came out rough, barely more than a whisper. I'm sorry I waited so long. That's what he said, for words that changed everything and explained nothing. I wanted to ask him who he was, how he knew me, why he'd waited, what he was sorry for. But the questions jammed in my throat. His eyes were closing, his grip loosening. A doctor appeared, gently moving me aside, and suddenly the room filled with people in scrubs moving with urgent efficiency. Someone ushered me out. Mrs. Chun was there, asking what happened, but I couldn't form words. We sat in those terrible waiting room chairs for 2 hours before a doctor came out and told us Robert Grant had passed away. She said it like she was reporting the weather. She'd probably said those same words 100 times that month. Mrs. Chun took me back to Riverside. I went through the motions of dinner and evening routine, answering questions from the other kids with words that didn't mean anything. That night, I lay in my narrow bed in the room I shared with 3 other boys and stared at the ceiling. I'm sorry I waited so long. The words circled in my head like birds that couldn't find a place to land. Waited for what? Waited to do what? Who was he? The lawyer called the next morning. His name was Bernard Winters, and he spoke with the careful precision of someone who delivered surprising news many times before. He asked if I was Tyler Monroe. I said yes. He asked if I'd been at the hospital yesterday to see Robert Grant. I said yes. He said Robert had named me as the sole beneficiary of his estate, and would I be available to meet at his office to discuss the details. He said it so calmly, like people inherited things from strangers every day. I asked what kind of estate. He said it would be better to discuss in person, but it was substantial. I asked what substantial meant. He paused, and I could hear papers rustling on his end. He said approximately $2 million in property, assets, and land. Then he asked again when I could meet. The world tilted. I sat down on the floor of the hallway, phone still pressed to my ear. $2 million. I'd been saving for 3 years to afford a security deposit on an apartment for when I aged out of the system in 6 months. I had $800. Now someone was telling me I'd inherited $2 million from a man whose name I'd learned 24 hours ago. Bernard Winters had an office downtown in one of those old brick buildings that smelled like wood polish and important decisions. Mrs. Chun drove me again. She'd stopped asking questions after the first dozen went unanswered. Sometimes the best kindness is silence. The office was exactly what you'd expect. Dark wood furniture, walls lined with law books that probably cost more than a car, and Bernard Winters himself, a man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He offered me tea. I said no. He sat behind his desk and folded his hands and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Then he said the strangest thing. He said, "You look exactly like him. Like Robert. Like your grandfather." The word hung in the air between us. Grandfather. I tried to speak, but nothing came out. Bernard opened a folder and slid a photograph across the desk. It showed a much younger Robert Grant, maybe 40, standing in front of a massive red barn with his arm around a woman with dark hair and a smile that reminded me of summer. Behind them stretched fields that seemed to go on forever. Bernard said that was Melissa Grant, my grandmother. She died 12 years ago. He said Robert had been devastated by her death, but kept the farm running because it was what she would have wanted. I finally found my voice. I asked why I'd never known about them. Why had I spent 17 years in an orphanage if I had a grandfather? Bernard's expression shifted to something sadder. He said Robert had made a choice after my parents died, a choice he regretted every day since. He'd been too consumed by grief to raise a child. My father was his only son, killed in that accident along with my mother, and Robert had convinced himself that a grieving old man couldn't give a baby what he needed. So he'd signed over custody to the state and spent the next 17 years building an empire to give to me instead. The folder contained more documents. Deeds, property assessments, financial statements. Grant Family Farm was massive, spanning over 300 acres of prime agricultural land in the valley about 50 miles north. The farm produced hay, corn, and alfalfa, and supplied feed to half the ranches in the state. It was profitable, completely paid off, and mine. Along with the house, the equipment, the vehicles, and substantial savings accounts. Bernard said Robert had been meticulous, planning every detail to ensure I'd be taken care of. Then he pulled out a sealed envelope. This arrived with his will, Bernard said. He asked that it be given to you only after his death. He wanted you to read it when he couldn't answer back, when you'd have to sit with his words alone. The envelope was thick, cream-colored paper, expensive. My name was written on it in shaky handwriting. Tyler. That was all. Just my name in the hand of a man I'd met for 5 minutes while he was dying. I stared at it, not ready to open it, not ready to hear whatever explanation or justification or apology waited inside. Bernard said I could take my time, that there was no rush. But his expression said there was more to this story, complications I hadn't heard yet. I opened the envelope. Inside were 3 pages written in that same shaky script, harder to read in places where the pen had dragged or the hand had trembled. The letter started with an apology. Tyler, I'm so sorry. Those were his first words to me at the hospital, and they were his first words in the letter too. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to be your grandfather when you needed one. I'm sorry I chose my own pain over your future. I'm sorry I watched you grow up from a distance instead of being part of your life. I've been a coward, and there's no forgiveness for that. But I want you to know that not a single day passed when I didn't think about you. The letter went on to explain what Bernard had already told me, but with more detail, more raw emotion. Robert described the day of the accident, getting the call that his son was gone, seeing me in the hospital as a tiny infant with no one left. He wrote about the panic that had seized him, the overwhelming weight of responsibility when he was barely holding himself together. He'd convinced himself that the state would find me a good family, that I'd have a better life with younger parents who could give me what he couldn't. He'd been wrong. He wrote about driving past Riverside home over the years, seeing me in the yard or through windows. He knew my case file number. He'd checked on me regularly through a social worker he'd paid to keep him informed. He knew I liked reading, that I was good at math, that I kept to myself mostly, but had a kind way with the younger kids. He knew everything and nothing. He'd watched my life like a movie he couldn't step into. Then the letter shifted. The last year, he wrote, he'd been diagnosed with congestive heart failure. The doctors gave him months. He'd spent that time building the farm into something extraordinary, something I could inherit and use as a foundation for whatever life I wanted to build. But there was a problem, and this is where Bernard's serious expression made sense. Robert's business partner, a man named Marcus Duval, had been trying to buy him out for decades. Marcus owned the land adjacent to the farm and had been vocal about wanting to expand. Robert had always refused, but Marcus was persistent. Now that Robert was gone, Marcus had apparently filed a legal challenge to the will, claiming Robert wasn't of sound mind in his final months and that the farm should be sold and the proceeds split according to some ancient partnership agreement Robert had supposedly made 40 years ago. The letter warned me about this. Robert wrote that Marcus would do everything possible to take the farm, that he'd been sabotaging operations for months, hoping to make the farm look unprofitable or mismanaged. Small things. Broken equipment that turned out to be tampered with. Shipments that went missing. Workers who suddenly quit. Robert had documented everything, kept records, but he knew a legal battle was coming. The will included a clause. I had 30 days to prove I could run the farm, to show that I was capable of managing the operations and maintaining profitability. If I couldn't, if the farm showed significant losses or operational failures during that period, the property would be reassessed and could potentially be sold to settle the estate. The letter ended with a request. Please don't let him win, Tyler. This farm is your birthright. It's the only thing I have left to give you, besides apologies and regrets. Your grandmother loved this place. Your father grew up here. It's yours. But you have to fight for it, and I know that's not fair. I'm asking you to fight for something you never asked for, something I should have given you 17 years ago without conditions. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't even deserve your time. But if you can find it in yourself to try, to give this place and this legacy a chance, I think you'll find it's a good life. The kind of life your parents would have wanted for you. It was signed simply, Grandfather. I read the letter twice while Bernard waited. The words blurred in places. I wasn't crying exactly. It was more like something was leaking out of me, some pressure I'd carried so long I'd forgotten it was there. When I finished, I looked up at Bernard and asked what happens if I can't do it. What happens if I fail in the 30 days? Bernard said the property would likely be sold. Marcus had enough legal standing to force a sale if I couldn't demonstrate competency. The money would still come to me, minus legal fees and Marcus's claimed share from the partnership agreement, but the farm itself would be gone. He said it carefully, like he was worried about how I'd react. Then he asked if I wanted to see it, the farm, before I made any decisions. We drove out that afternoon. Mrs. Chen came too, bless her, because I don't think I could have processed any of it alone. The farm was an hour north, past the city sprawl, and into the valley where the land opened up into fields and sky. We followed a dirt road off the highway, through gates that said Grant Family Farm in faded letters, and up a long driveway lined with ancient oak trees. The house appeared first, a big 2-story farmhouse painted white with a wraparound porch and shutters that needed updating but gave the place character. Beyond it stood the barn Robert had been standing in front of in that photograph, still red but weathered now, solid and real. Past the barn were the fields, 300 acres of flat, rich land that looked like it belonged in a painting. Equipment was parked near a large metal building. Trucks, tractors, combines. Everything looked maintained but used, the way working tools should look. We parked in front of the house. Nobody said anything for a long moment. This was mine. This entire place, this impossible, beautiful place, was mine. I got out of the car. The air smelled different here, cleaner somehow, like grass and earth and something I couldn't name. The porch steps creaked under my weight. The front door was locked, but Bernard had keys. He handed them to me and stepped back, letting me open the door myself. Inside was frozen in time. The house looked lived in but lonely, like someone had walked out expecting to come back. Mail sat on a table by the door, magazines from last month. A coffee cup in the sink. Coats hung by the door. I walked through slowly, taking it in. The living room had a stone fireplace and comfortable furniture that sagged in the right places. Photographs covered the mantel. Robert and Melissa Young, middle-aged old. My father as a boy, a teenager, a young man. And me. Several of me, at different ages, candid shots that must have been taken from a distance. Me at 8, reading on the orphanage steps. Me at 12, playing basketball in the yard. Me last year, walking home from the library. He'd really been watching, documenting, caring from afar. Upstairs were 4 bedrooms. The master bedroom was clearly Robert's, simple and neat. One room was set up as an office, filled with paperwork and farm records. The third was empty except for boxes. The fourth stopped me in my tracks. It was a bedroom clearly prepared for someone my age. A bed with a quilt that looked handmade, a desk, bookshelves filled with books I would have loved as a kid. A poster for a band I'd mentioned liking once in an overheard conversation. He'd been preparing for me, planning for a day when I might come here, even if he never got to see it. Mrs. Chun found me there. She didn't say anything, just stood in the doorway while I sat on the bed that was supposed to be mine and tried to understand what this all meant. Finally, she asked what I was thinking. I said I didn't know how to run a farm. I'd never even mowed a lawn. I'd spent my whole life in a facility with concrete yards and donated everything. This was so far outside my experience it might as well be another planet. She said that was probably true, but I was smart and I learned fast. She'd seen me figure out harder things. I asked like what? She said like how to survive 17 years without a family and not let it make you mean. That's harder than farming, she said. Then she told me she'd support whatever I decided, but I should probably see the rest of the operation before I made up my mind. Bernard had arranged for the farm manager to meet us, a man named Jack Moreno who'd worked for Robert for 20 years. Jack was waiting by the barn, 50-something with sun-weathered skin and hands that looked like they could fix anything. He shook my hand and said he was sorry about Robert, that he'd been a good man and a fair boss. Then, without being asked, he said he'd help me learn the operation if I wanted, that the crew was solid and the farm practically ran itself if you knew what you were doing and didn't mind hard work. He showed us around. The barn housed equipment and served as a workshop. The large metal building was for hay storage and processing. Fields were currently planted with alfalfa and winter wheat, with irrigation systems Robert had modernized 5 years ago. Jack explained the crop rotation, the customer base, the supply contracts. It was overwhelming, a flood of information about things I'd never considered. But Jack had a patient way of explaining, breaking complex operations into understandable pieces. He said Robert had left detailed records, that everything was documented and organized. Then Jack said something that changed my thinking. He said Marcus had been coming around more lately, making offers to buy out workers, suggesting they might not have jobs much longer. He'd told one of the tractor operators that the place would be shut down within the month, that he'd hire anyone who wanted to keep working when he took over. Jack said the crew was nervous. They'd heard about the will challenge and the 30-day clause. They liked their jobs and didn't want to work for Marcus, who had a reputation for squeezing every penny and cutting corners. They were hoping I'd fight for the place. That hit differently. This wasn't just about me and Robert and inherited guilt. Real people with real lives depended on this place. Jack said they employed 12 people full-time, plus seasonal workers during harvest. Those were jobs in a valley where employment was scarce. The farm supported families, paid mortgages, put kids through school. If Marcus took over and consolidated, half those jobs would disappear. He'd said as much to people in town. We walked the fields as the sun dropped toward the horizon. The light turned everything gold, the kind of beautiful that makes you understand why people paint landscapes. Jack pointed out sections, explained what was planted where and why. He talked about soil quality and water rights and market prices. Some of it stuck, most of it didn't, but I appreciated that he treated me like someone worth teaching instead of a kid who'd inherited something he didn't deserve. On the drive back, I was quiet. Mrs. Chin didn't push. She'd learned I needed time to process before I could talk. We were almost back to Riverside when I finally said I wanted to try. I said it might be stupid and I'd probably fail, but I wanted to try. For Robert, for the workers, for the version of myself who used to imagine having a home and never thought it would happen. Mrs. Chun smiled and said she'd thought I'd say that. The next morning I met with Bernard to sign paperwork. He'd prepared a plan. I'd move to the farm immediately, stay in that prepared bedroom, and spend the 30 days learning the operation with Jack's help. Bernard would handle the legal defense against Marcus's challenge. The crew would be informed that I was taking over management and would appreciate their patience while I learned. School would have to wait, at least for a month. Bernard had already filed the necessary paperwork for educational leave. Everything was organized, ready, like Robert had planned for this exact scenario. I packed my life into 2 bags, which tells you something about how little I'd accumulated in 17 years. The other kids at Riverside were confused, but supportive in that way teenagers are when they don't know what to say. Mrs. Chun hugged me at the door and said to call if I needed anything. Then I loaded my bags into Bernard's car and left the only home I'd ever known for one I'd inherited from a ghost. The farm felt different when I arrived, knowing I'd be staying. More real, more daunting. Jack met me with a schedule. Wake up at 5, check the irrigation systems, meet with crew, review the day's priorities, handle whatever problems arose, paperwork in the evening, bed by 9. Farm life, he said, didn't care if you were tired. The work happened on nature's timeline, not yours. That first week was brutal. I learned that farming is mostly problem-solving and physical labor with brief moments of satisfaction scattered throughout. A pump broke on day 2. I helped Jack replace it, getting covered in mud and learning more about plumbing than I wanted to know. 3 steers broke through a fence on day 4. We spent 6 hours fixing the fence and rounding them up. A buyer changed their order on day 6, leaving us with 2 tons of alfalfa we had to redistribute. Every day brought new challenges, new things I didn't know how to handle. But I also learned I was capable of more than I thought. My body adapted to the early mornings and physical work. My brain started making connections, understanding how the pieces fit together. Jack was an excellent teacher, patient and thorough. He'd explain something once, watch me try it, correct my mistakes, and move on. The crew warmed up gradually, testing me with questions and problems to see if I'd fold. I didn't. I might not know what I was doing, but I showed up every day and tried, and that counted for something. Marcus Duval showed up on day 9. I was in the barn helping repair a combine when a white truck pulled into the yard. The man who got out was tall and lean, probably 60, with sharp features and sharper eyes. He walked like he owned the place, which I guess he thought he soon would. He found me in the barn and introduced himself without offering a handshake. He said he wanted to make me an offer. He'd buy me out for $1.5 million, cash, immediate settlement. I'd walk away with money, no hassle, no 30-day trial, no stress. He said it with the confidence of someone used to getting what he wanted. He said I seemed like a smart kid, and smart kids knew when they were in over their heads. Running a farm wasn't something you learned in a month. I'd fail the competency clause. The property would be tied up in legal battles for years, and I'd spend whatever inheritance I had left on lawyer fees. His way was cleaner. I was covered in grease, exhausted from a week of 12-hour days, and standing in a barn I barely knew how to navigate. But something about his tone, the way he dismissed me without even trying to hide it, made my decision easy. I said no. He blinked, surprised. He said I should think about it, talk to my lawyer, be reasonable. I said I had thought about it, and the answer was no. His expression hardened. He said I was making a mistake, that this wasn't a game. Then he left, truck spitting gravel as he drove away. Jack had been listening from the office. He came out looking worried. He said Marcus wasn't the kind of man who took no for an answer, that I should watch for trouble. I asked what kind of trouble. Jack said the kind that's hard to prove, that looks like accidents or bad luck, but isn't. He said to be careful and to document everything. The trouble started on day 12. We found 3 slashed tires on the equipment truck. On day 14, someone left a gate open and we lost half a day rounding up livestock that had wandered onto the highway. On day 16, a shipment of feed we'd ordered never showed up, the supplier claiming they'd never received our order despite our confirmation emails. Small things, annoying things, things that cost time and money and made the farm look disorganized. Jack started taking pictures, keeping logs. I helped, documenting every incident with timestamps and details. Bernard said it was good we were keeping records, but warned that proving deliberate sabotage was difficult. We needed to catch someone in the act or find direct evidence of Marcus's involvement. Until then, it was our word against coincidence. Day 18 brought a bigger problem. The main irrigation pump failed, the one that watered 40 acres of alfalfa. Jack diagnosed it immediately. Someone had poured sand into the system, grinding the gears and destroying the mechanism. This wasn't an accident or bad luck. This was deliberate, expensive sabotage that could kill an entire crop if not fixed immediately. The replacement part would take 3 days to arrive and cost $8,000. I called Bernard. He said this was exactly what we needed, clear evidence of tampering. He'd document it, maybe even get the police involved. But the immediate problem remained. We had 3 days to keep 40 acres watered with a broken primary pump. Jack said we could rig something with backup pumps and portable systems, but it would take all hands and creative thinking. We worked around the clock. The crew stepped up, everyone pitching in with ideas and labor. We created a patchwork system using every pump on the property, running hoses and temporary lines. It was exhausting and ridiculous, and somehow it worked. We kept the fields watered. When the replacement part arrived, Jack and I installed it together, working by flashlight into the night. By day 21, the system was back to full function and the crop was saved. Bernard filed formal complaints with the police. The sand in the pump was clear evidence of criminal tampering. An investigation opened. Marcus denied everything, claimed he'd been out of town during the relevant time period, suggested maybe I'd damaged it myself for sympathy. The police said they'd look into it, but seemed skeptical that anyone would care enough about farm drama to commit crimes. Day 25 brought unexpected help. 3 neighboring farmers showed up at the property offering equipment and labor. They'd heard about what was happening, about Marcus's attempts to take over and the sabotage. They said Robert had been a good neighbor, and they didn't like seeing his legacy destroyed by a man who viewed farming as nothing more than a business acquisition. They offered to help however I needed for the remaining days. It was the first time I understood community, real community, the kind that shows up when you need it without being asked. These men didn't know me. They had their own farms to run, their own problems to handle. But they came anyway because Robert had been part of something larger than himself, and they wanted to honor that. We worked together, and slowly I started to feel less like an imposter and more like someone who belonged. Day 28 was inspection day. A court-appointed agricultural consultant arrived to assess the farm's operations and my competency. He spent 12 hours reviewing records, walking fields, interviewing crew, examining equipment. He was thorough and professional, asking detailed questions about crop management, financial planning, labor relations, and future projections. Jack stood with me for most of it, helping explain technical aspects I was still learning. The consultant asked about the sabotage. I showed him our documentation, the photos, the logs, the police reports. He asked how we'd handled it. I explained the workarounds, the community support, the solutions we'd implemented. He asked what I'd learned in 30 days. I said I'd learned that farming was harder than anything I'd ever done, that community mattered more than individual capability, and that sometimes the best thing you can inherit is the responsibility to take care of something bigger than yourself. He didn't give any indication of his conclusions. He said he'd file his report with the court within 48 hours. Then he left, and we waited. Day 30 arrived with no news. I woke up at 5 like I had every day for a month, checked the irrigation systems like I'd learned to do, met with the crew like it was routine. We had work to do regardless of what the court decided. Fields needed tending. Equipment needed maintenance. Life on a farm didn't pause for legal proceedings. Bernard called at noon. He said the consultant's report had been filed. It was detailed, thorough, and concluded that I'd demonstrated remarkable competency given the circumstances. The farm was well managed, profitable, and sustainably operated. The consultant noted that while I was inexperienced, I'd shown the ability to learn quickly, make sound decisions under pressure, and build effective working relationships with experienced staff. He recommended that the will be upheld and the property transferred to me without restriction. Marcus's challenge was dismissed. The judge cited the consultant's findings and the documented evidence of sabotage as proof that any operational difficulties were the result of external interference rather than my incompetence. Bernard said Marcus could still appeal, but it was unlikely to succeed. The farm was mine. I sat down on the porch steps after hanging up, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical work. It was over. 30 days of proving myself, of learning to do something completely foreign, of fighting for a legacy I'd never asked for. And somehow, impossibly, I'd done it. Jack found me there. He asked if I'd heard. I said yes. He asked what I was going to do now. I said I guessed I'd keep learning, keep trying, keep running the farm. He smiled and said that sounded like a good plan. Then he asked if I wanted to walk the fields before dinner to see the sunset from the East Ridge. I said yes. We walked out past the barn, through the fields where alfalfa was growing green and strong despite everything that had tried to stop it. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed too beautiful to be real. Jack pointed out things I was still learning to see, the subtle signs of healthy crops, the way water moved through the irrigation channels, the distant line where our property met Marcus's land. He asked if I was angry at Robert for putting me through this. I thought about it. I said no. I said I understood why he'd done it, that maybe he'd known I needed to fight for this place to really claim it as mine. If he'd just handed it to me without conditions, I might have sold it, taken the money, and walked away. But fighting for it, learning it, almost losing it, that had made it real. It had made it mine in a way that just inheriting it never could have. Jack said that was wise for someone so young. I said I didn't feel young anymore. He laughed and said farming does that to people, ages you, and makes you appreciate things at the same time. Then he asked what I thought Robert would say if he could see me now. I said I thought he'd say he was proud. And maybe sorry. Definitely sorry. But also proud. That night, I ate dinner alone in the farmhouse for the first time since moving in. Usually I ate with Jack and some of the crew at the barn, talking through the next day's plans. But tonight Jack had suggested I take time for myself, to process everything that had happened. I made something simple, sat at the kitchen table where Robert had sat for decades, and looked at the photographs on the mantel. There was one of my father as a child, maybe 7 or 8, standing in front of the barn holding a fishing pole and smiling wide. He looked happy, loved. This had been his home, the place where he grew up safe and cared for. And if the accident hadn't happened, it would have been mine too. I'd have grown up here, learned farming from Robert and my father, had a completely different life. But that life hadn't happened, and the life I'd actually lived, hard as it was, had made me into someone who could handle this. I thought about what Robert wrote in his letter, about regret and apology and the weight of choices we can't take back. I thought about the 30 days I'd just spent learning to be someone I never imagined being. I thought about community and legacy and the strange way life sometimes gives you exactly what you need in the form you least expect. Then I went upstairs to the bedroom Robert had prepared for me, climbed into the bed with the handmade quilt, and slept better than I had in years. I slept in a house that was mine, on land that was mine, with a future that was mine to build. And when I woke up the next morning at 5, I didn't hit snooze. I got up, got dressed, and went to check the irrigation systems. Because that's what you do when you have a farm. You take care of it. The following weeks settled into a rhythm. I enrolled in online classes to finish my final year of high school while managing the farm. Jack continued teaching me, gradually stepping back as I grew more confident. The crew accepted me fully, not as Robert's grandson or an inexperienced kid, but as their boss who worked alongside them and listened to their expertise. We had good days and hard days, successful harvests and unexpected problems. That's farming. Marcus kept his distance after losing in court. His appeal was denied. Eventually, he sold his adjacent land and moved to another state, much to everyone's relief. The valley was quieter without him trying to expand his empire at everyone else's expense. I found more letters Robert had left, tucked into books and drawers around the house. Small notes written over the years, addressed to me, but never sent. They documented his thoughts, his regrets, his pride and accomplishments he'd heard about through his social worker contact. Reading them was painful and healing at the same time. He'd cared. He'd always cared. He'd just been broken in a way that made caring from a distance the only way he knew how. One letter, dated a year before his death, stuck with me. He wrote that he'd been watching me handle a situation at Riverside where a younger kid was being bullied. He wrote that I'd stepped in calmly, defused the situation, and spent time afterward making sure the younger kid felt safe. He said that moment had shown him who I'd become despite never having a family to model it after. He said I was kind in the way his wife Melissa had been kind, thoughtful in the way his son had been thoughtful. He said he saw his family in me, and it gave him hope that maybe some things passed down even without being taught. I framed that letter and hung it in the office where I did paperwork. On particularly hard days, when farming felt overwhelming and I questioned whether I was doing anything right, I'd read it and remember that someone had believed in me enough to build an empire and leave it in my hands. That kind of faith, even from a man I barely knew, meant something. Spring came, and with it planting season. My first real planting as the owner, making decisions about what to grow where and when. Jack guided me, but increasingly he'd ask what I thought before offering his opinion. He said I had good instincts, that I was learning to read the land and the weather and the subtle signs that separate good farmers from lucky ones. I didn't know if that was true, but I appreciated his confidence. I hired 2 new workers, brothers who'd just moved to the valley looking for stable employment. Training them felt strange at first, me teaching people older than I was about work I'd only recently learned. But I discovered that teaching something is the best way to really understand it yourself. Explaining crop rotation and irrigation timing and equipment maintenance forced me to think through not just how but why, to understand the principles instead of just following steps. The town slowly started to see me as part of the community rather than the orphan kid who'd inherited Robert's place. I got invited to county agricultural meetings. People asked my opinion on water rights debates and equipment cooperatives. I was introduced at the local diner not as Tyler the new guy, but as Tyler Grant, Robert's grandson, like it was natural that I belonged to this place and this family. Sometimes in the evenings I'd sit on the porch and think about parallel lives. The life where my parents hadn't died and I'd grown up here surrounded by family. The life where Robert had kept me instead of giving me up and I'd known him as grandfather instead of stranger. The life where the orphanage had found me an adoptive family and I'd grown up suburban and normal. All these lives I might have lived, paths that branched away from the one I'd actually walked. But this life, this unexpected, inherited, complicated life, was mine. And it was good. Not perfect, not easy, but good in the way that meaningful things are good. I had purpose. I had work that mattered. I had land that depended on my decisions and people who depended on my leadership. I had a legacy that stretched back through Robert and Melissa and my father, and forward into whatever future I'd build here. On the anniversary of Robert's death, I drove to the cemetery where he was buried next to Melissa and my father. I hadn't been there before. I'd avoided it, not ready to face the graves of people I should have known but didn't. But a year seemed like enough time. Jack had told me where it was, a small cemetery on a hill overlooking the valley with views of the farm in the distance. Their headstones were simple. Robert and Melissa Grant together, my father's slightly apart. Someone, probably Jack, had been maintaining them, keeping the grass trimmed and leaving fresh flowers. I sat between the graves and talked. I told them about the year, about learning to farm, about the crew and the community. I told them about the house and the bedroom Robert had prepared and the letters he'd left. I told them I understood why Robert had made the choices he did, that grief does strange things to people, and sometimes the best we can do is survive it and try to make amends later. I told my father I wished I'd known him, that the photos showed someone I'd probably have liked. I told him I was trying to take care of the place he grew up in, to honor the work his father had built. I told him I thought he'd be proud of how I'd fought for it. I told Melissa I'd heard she was kind, that Robert had said I reminded him of her. I said I hoped that was true, that kindness seemed like a good thing to inherit. I told her the quilt she'd made was on my bed and I used it every night, that it was the most valuable thing I owned because someone I never met had made it with their own hands thinking about keeping me warm. And I told Robert the first forgave him, that carrying anger about what he'd done or didn't do felt pointless now. He'd been human, flawed, broken by loss in a way that made him make terrible choices. But he'd also spent 17 years trying to build something good enough to make up for it. The farm wasn't a replacement for a childhood with family, but it was something. It was a foundation. It was a place to build from. The wind moved through the cemetery, carrying the smell of fresh-cut hay from the valley below. I could see the farm from here, my farm, the red barn and white house and fields stretching toward the horizon. It looked like something out of a painting, the kind of view people pay money to see. And it was mine. Not because I'd earned it through years of work, not because I was particularly deserving, but because a broken old man had spent the last years of his life trying to give his grandson a home. I left flowers on all 3 graves. Melissa's favorite, according to Jack, had been sunflowers. I'd brought a bunch from the farm, bright yellow faces turned toward the sun. They looked right there, cheerful and warm. I said goodbye and walked back to my truck, the one that used to be Robert's, with the Grant family farm logo on the door. Driving back, I thought about everything that had to happen for me to end up here. The accident that killed my parents. Robert's decision to give me up. 17 years in Riverside. The hospital call. The 30-day trial. Marcus's sabotage. Every terrible, difficult, painful thing that had brought me to this moment, driving home to a farm I never knew existed a year ago. And somehow, impossibly, it felt right. Like all those tangled threads of loss and regret and unexpected inheritance had woven together into something resembling purpose. I wasn't grateful for the pain, exactly, but I was grateful for where it had led. That night, I worked on farm records late into the evening, reviewing production numbers and planning next season's rotation. Jack stopped by around 9 to discuss a broken tractor. We talked through repair versus replacement, cost analysis, timeline considerations. Regular stuff. Farm stuff. The kind of conversation I'd have been completely lost in a year ago and now handled without thinking twice. After Jack left, I poured a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the fields. The moon was bright enough to see the distant tree line, the dark shapes of equipment parked by the barn. This view, this life, this impossible gift from a grandfather I'd met once while he was dying. It was mine to keep or ruin, to build on or abandon. Mine to pass forward or let end with me. I thought about the letter Robert had written, the one that started with apology and ended with a request not to let Marcus win. But it wasn't really about Marcus, and maybe Robert had known that. It was about not giving up on the possibility that broken things can be repaired, that legacies can be rebuilt, that even when people fail you in the ways that matter most, sometimes they spend the rest of their lives trying to make it right. The farm was Robert's apology made tangible. Every field he'd modernized, every system he'd optimized, every dollar he'd saved. It was all him saying sorry in the only language he knew how to speak. And by fighting for it, by choosing to stay and learn and build something here, I was saying I heard him. I understood. I forgave. Maybe that's all anyone can ask for. To be understood and forgiven despite their failures. To have their efforts at redemption acknowledged, even if they come too late to undo the damage. To leave behind something good enough that it balances the scales a little. The farm was that for Robert. And for me, it was becoming something else. A home. A purpose. A foundation to build a life on that was mine, not inherited in the sense of being given without effort, but earned through 30 days of trial and every day since. Earned through learning and failing and trying again. Earned through choosing to see possibility instead of loss. I finished my water and locked up for the night, checking doors and windows the way I'd learned to do. Upstairs in the bedroom Robert had prepared, I got ready for bed with the kind of tired that comes from a full day of meaningful work. The quilt Melissa had made was soft and warm. The house creaked and settled around me. Comfortable sounds that meant I was home. Before sleep, I thought one more time about that moment in the hospital, Robert's hand in mine, his whispered apology. I'm sorry I waited so long. At the time, I hadn't known what he meant. Now I did. He'd waited to be my grandfather until he was dying. Waited to give me a home until he couldn't share it with me. Waited to tell the truth until silence was guaranteed. But he'd also given me something nobody else could have. A place that was completely mine. A legacy with no strings except the ones I chose to honor. A foundation built from regret and hope and 17 years of watching from a distance. It wasn't a perfect inheritance, but it was real, and it was enough. I fell asleep in the house my father grew up in, on land my grandparents had worked, in a bed prepared by a man who loved me the only way his broken heart knew how. And when morning came, I'd wake up and do it all again. Check the irrigation. Meet with the crew. Handle whatever problems arose. Build the life that was waiting for me in fields I was only beginning to understand. That was the deal, really. Not the legal 30-day trial or the court-appointed consultant or any of the official measures. The real deal was simpler. Show up. Do the work. Honor what came before while building something new. That's what Robert had really been asking for in that letter. Not perfection, not instant expertise, just the willingness to try. To fight for the legacy he'd built from his own regrets. And I had. I would. Every morning at 5 when the alarm went off and I had the choice to stay in bed or get up and check the irrigation systems, I'd choose the farm. Choose the work. Choose the life that had chosen me in the strangest way possible. Because sometimes the best gifts are the ones we never knew we needed, delivered by people we barely knew, wrapped in complications that force us to fight for them. This farm, this impossible inheritance, this apology made tangible in 300 acres and a white farmhouse and equipment that needed constant maintenance. It was all of that and more. It was home. Finally, after 17 years of not having one, I had a home. And I'd be damned if I was going to let anything take it away.